Good morning, Carol. We're glad to have you here at Links 22 and appreciate the time for you and the administration to share some important insights with us. I thought maybe to sort of kick it off, you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what first interested you in this crypto space.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So first, I'm so thrilled to be here in a room with a bunch of compliance professionals. I know who doesn't love regulation, right? When it's countering money launderers and terrorist financiers. But so my background is a little bit of a patchwork quilt. I'm sure, like many of the people in the room. I actually started in the Army as a chemical and biological, radiological, nuclear defense officer, so all the gas mask stuff, if any of you served. I also did intelligence work as a collection manager, helping to manage all the assets that watch and listen to people and take pictures and make sure that they were supporting the operators as they needed. I promise that makes sense later when I bring up FinCEN. After that, my first tour in the White House, I started working in cyber, a national security unit that was being stood up in the Office of Management and Budget. Spent some time at Senate and then at FinCEN, so love to see Alessio speaking and those incredible remarks. It's a fantastic agency. But all that background really exposed me to cryptocurrency, especially first when I was at OMB, and coming at it from that hard cyber background, where I knew blockchain as two words, as like blockchain cipher encryption, and then sort of seeing it from afar, like this combination of encryption and distributed computing to create blockchain as one word. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty interesting, actually. And during my initial time at FinCEN, when you go to combat financial crimes and you work on the cybersecurity desk, it's impossible to get caught up in cryptocurrency because it's a cyber criminal's favored tool for money laundering, whether it's purchasing their exploit kits up front or laundering their proceeds on the back end. So I got exposure to that, both how it was being exploited, but then also the potential benefits for investigations. So I think that was a really interesting nexus into it. I'm sure many people in the room, some of their first exposure to cryptocurrency was seeing its exploitation on the illicit side.
So you're now at the National Security Council, working at the White House. Tell us a little bit about what that involves and what are you doing there?
Yeah, so first, this is just the most fun job in the world. So I'm the Director for Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation. So starting last spring, I got to come aboard to support the administration's work focused on building and helping to manage and lead the U.S. counter-ransomware strategy, as well as our work on digital identity and then, of course, digital assets. So really what that's meant has been working with the entire interagency through the coordination process and interagency policy committees to try to establish what is the strategic direction that the administration really wants to take on some of these key issues. The three areas that I work in especially, I know I mentioned ransomware and cybersecurity, cybercrime, and identity, all have a really interesting overlap and nexus with each other. Like identity is one of those key aspects of the cryptocurrency ecosystem that's been missing for so long, and I'm so thrilled to see so many entrepreneurs really focusing on the kinds of developments that need to be built into that space that will help facilitate things like compliance. Identity is also very commonly at play when it's compromised in cybercrime. So ransomware, we hear all the time that it could have been thwarted simply through implementing multi-factor authentication. So another great example about how identity plays in both cryptocurrency and ransomware. And of course, with ransomware, most of the payments are in cryptocurrency. So all these things really play on each other in a very interesting way. So I've been able to do that as well as supporting some broader illicit finance work for the administration. And we got the executive order out, thanks to Alessio for giving a shout out to that. That was a wonderful thing. Very thrilled to see President Biden support that and really set the entire U.S. government in a good strategic direction.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about executive order, and you also discussed a little bit about your work with ransomware. And we're going to circle back to ransomware in a little bit, but let's just take up this topic of the executive order. So the president issued the executive order on digital assets. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that executive order entails and what you hope to get out of it?
Yeah. Well, the executive order is, for the first time ever, having a president state that there is a strategic direction that the entire US government and hopefully the whole nation needs to take in order to promote the responsible development of the digital asset ecosystem. So first, I'll highlight that a really key takeaway, if you only get one thing from that EO, is looking at that balance between the significant risks that exist in the cryptocurrency space, but also looking at where there are potential points of promise and potential innovation that we really want to stoke and be able to drive inside of the United States and with our international partners. So again, it created this comprehensive framework that's now chaired by both the National Security Council as well as the National Economic Council. So the administration sees that cryptocurrency and distributed ledger technologies have potential implications, not just on the economic front, but also on the national security front. And the president felt that it was impossible for only one of these policy councils to lead those efforts alone, so it had to be co-chaired appropriately. Of course, there's other parts of the White House, like our Office of Science and Technology Policy, that also are featured roles inside of the executive order. So it's really like a whole of White House approach, and then of course whole of government. So I mentioned this interagency process. So you'll see, of course, inviting the regulators to come and join our efforts, and they've been critical partners to date. Of course, Department of the Treasury and law enforcement, but also lots of other agencies like the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, USAID, Department of State, Department of Homeland Security. A lot of these agencies, which have diverse authorities outside of just regulation, sometimes in the crypto space, I'll only hear people really focusing on the regulatory aspects, but you have powerful agencies with incredible mission sets and equities, as well as authorities in areas like research and development. And so I'm very excited to see the really diverse grouping of agencies that are bucketed under the interagency policy process that's established in the EO. Finally, the president establishes key policy objectives for the digital asset space. And this is where I would turn to many of you being in industry. I'll say that hopefully this is a signal from the administration. We would encourage industry to consider looking at how your developments can support the growth of the cryptocurrency ecosystem in a way consistent with the objectives outlined in the EO. Like, he points to critical consumer protections and market protections that must be in place. The need for ensuring financial stability, as well as the role of the United States in the financial system, and strengthening and reinforcing the role of the US dollar. We look at making sure that we are promoting technological developments and innovations that will allow for the responsible development of this ecosystem, trying to combat other risks like climate impacts that we've seen in the digital asset space, and that are very real concerns that the administration wants to make sure that we understand what are the actual impacts and what are the potential mitigating factors that we can put in place. So the president outlined all those key policy objectives and then set agencies off on a bunch of different lines of efforts, a lot of different reports that agencies are very actively underway developing right now. So they're looking to produce reports on things like the future of money, as well as on the environmental impacts of digital assets and their underlying technologies. There's also a report on the technological infrastructure and capacity and expertise that the US government needs in order to potentially build a US central bank digital currency. And then the illicit finance strategy that was just published recently, there are some lines of effort related to that on producing annexes related to digital asset illicit finance risks, as well as developing a whole of government action plan to support combating those risks in digital assets. So really establishing that comprehensive approach, outlining the key policy objectives, and then setting agencies off on producing these assessments, developing and following through on these action plans and frameworks are really key components of the executive order. Very excited about it.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating to look at the executive order because it's so comprehensive in nature. It's not just a compliance or regulatory order, but it takes in these topics of financial inclusion, technology innovation, and how whole of governments. And you mentioned this myriad of agencies that the traditional individual would say, well, what do they have a role with digital assets? And yet, as the order articulates, it's a vast approach. So thank you very much. Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. Can you give our audience a little insight into what kind of timelines are we looking at with regard to this executive order and these reports that you talked about?
Gotcha. It's a range. A couple of the deadlines are 90 and 120 days. So some of those are coming up on some of the law enforcement assessments. So looking at the role of law enforcement in combating illicit use of cryptocurrency, as well as the kinds of steps that we can take to bolster international cooperation for law enforcement in combating this illicit exploitation. And then all the way out to, I think the longest timeline is 210 days. And that was encouraging the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, to examine and produce recommendations related to the financial stability risks of digital assets. So lots of different reports in there. So it's reports, some frameworks for international engagement and competitiveness, as well as an action plan to mitigate the illicit finance risks.
Well, those are pretty tight timelines, and things are going to be moving quickly. I guess really the next logical question is, how can this industry help?
Yeah.
What can they do?
Great. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, since today was a wonderful announcement by the Department of Commerce. The International Trade Administration, ITA, and Commerce just this morning published a request for comment on developing a framework for competitiveness in the digital asset space. So looking at in digital assets and leveraging their technologies as well. They posted a series of maybe 20 or more questions, I think, for industry. They've got tons of questions out there about the kinds of things, whether standards or policies that would be needed to drive U.S. competitiveness in digital assets and their underlying technologies, looking at considerations for things like financial inclusion and the role that that plays in competitiveness. As well as other measures that we need to be taking. So first, I'll put a call out to everyone here. Please look at that RFC, and congratulations. I think Commerce is in the room today, actually, for putting that out. Hey, Paul. But for everybody else, please submit comments. It's a really thoughtful RFC, and otherwise continuing to engage. I know the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, had previously published an RFI. A request for information, asking for data from the public, academics, industry, anyone related to the environmental implications of digital assets. So all of these opportunities where the government is putting out a request for comments, we mean it. We need that data, we need that input. There have been too many conversations that I've seen with industry where they point to things like benefits of financial inclusion, or they say that that the environmental impacts of proof of work mining actually aren't so significant, but then we're not really seeing the data. We need to make informed decisions. We need the data in order to make sure that we understand what are the trade-offs between different consensus mechanisms. What are the types of risk-based frameworks and regulatory approaches that we need to be putting in place for the system? What are the things that we should be incentivizing and driving? I think we can't do that without data. So all of those calls for information are completely earnest, and we're looking for input. So please respond. Other than that, I know that the agencies that are leading all of the reports have been very forward-leaning and engaging and meeting with industry. Forums like this are really critical, looking at and examining the key issues that are identified in the executive order. And flagging policy recommendations. If there's ever some recommendations that are published, please flag those for us and for those relevant agencies. So continue to engage with us, leveraging innovation hours like what Alessio mentioned at FinCEN, also a really critical venue. Finally, I think the combating illicit finance point coming from FinCEN, I can't not hit on the illicit finance issue. Under the counter ransomware framework, we actually launched an NCI, JTF, and FBI-led illicit virtual asset notification partnership. So that combined also with just there are a lot of other partnerships out there that I would encourage the cryptocurrency sector to think about to be able to better defend yourselves. A lot of cybercrime ends up targeting you all, and unfortunately by some illicit actors that can end up having national security level implications when you have rogue regimes stealing $500 million that ultimately may end up being used to support their proliferation activities. So looking at things like the information sharing and analysis centers that exist for all the different critical infrastructure sectors. There is a financial services sector, ISAC, or what other opportunities are there for partnerships across the cryptocurrency industry to share information and leveraging the civil liability protections that you have under 314B for anti-money laundering info sharing or for sharing cyber information with each other. There's a liability protection there under the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. So hopefully that helps give industry a good steer, like looking to the policy objectives in the executive order. How can we build these critical things, critical controls into these systems up front, engaging with the government as we're developing these assessments, responding to these requests, and then working with each other to achieve the objectives in the EO, like looking at the potential for partnerships that you can all drive.
Well, I know the industry appreciates the opportunity to engage the administration and for the transparency and forward-leaning way the administration is approaching this. This is democracy in action. So thank you for that invitation, and I look forward to the reports and results of this. Let's pivot a little bit now to this topic of ransomware. There's not a person in this audience who isn't concerned about the impact that ransomware is having both on this industry and on the economy and our larger national security writ large. So tell us a little bit about what is the administration doing to help combat this scourge of ransomware?
Yeah, thank you. And you're right, the cryptocurrency space has been critical both in being used and exploited in ransomware, but it's also a really critical lever in trying to disrupt it also. So the administration sees that ransomware is certainly a cybersecurity and cybercrime problem, but it's also a money laundering problem. We have absolutely seen that there are vulnerabilities in cybersecurity weaknesses, like I mentioned before, about weaknesses in identity, credentialing and access management solutions, that are culprits here. Also vulnerabilities in the cryptocurrency AML ecosystem. A lot of institutions that have facilitated being the place where these cyber criminals can cash out their proceeds. However, it's also not just a cybercrime and financial problem. Like, I think both cyber and financial vectors offer us tools to be able to disrupt this activity as well. So I think we've seen that. The U.S. counter-ransomware strategy, and we published a fact sheet on the White House webpage last fall, points out how the U.S. government has organized our efforts across 4 key priority lines of effort. Targeting and disrupting priority actors, infrastructure, and financial facilitators of this activity. Bolstering international cooperation, to be able to combat the transnational criminal groups that end up supporting both ransomware criminal activity as well as the associated money laundering, combating the misuse of cryptocurrency, and then a surge focus on resilience and working with the cyber insurance sector as well to better incentivize cybersecurity protections. So those 4 lines of effort, and there's lots of different authorities that we've brought to the table here. State has offered rewards for justice and their transnational organized crime rewards program, offering rewards for those that can give information that ultimately ends up leading to successful prosecution of these criminals. We've brought indictments against our evil actors. We've brought sanctions designations that Alessio and Andrea spoke to earlier today against lots of exchanges that have facilitated activity. You know, Chadex, Suex, Garantex, and as well as Hydra, Darknet Marketplace. So all of these highlight how very seriously we're taking the financial part of the ransomware ecosystem, and that we're going to continue to drive disruption there, and then leverage whatever actions that we can to combat to combat cryptocurrency being the thing that has allowed for the scaling of ransomware to become the problem that it is, but instead to become this tool and to facilitate this ecosystem of information sharing to be able to rapidly interdict these proceeds.
Well, that's fascinating. Blockchain analytics and cryptocurrency is the key to disrupting the ransomware threat. It gives us that insight into mapping these criminals and their criminal networks. Let's talk a little bit about public-private partnerships. What is the administration's approach to that, and how are you leveraging public-private partnerships to address these threats, including ransomware?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you hit on that point. And I know I spoke to it a little bit earlier. We can't do this alone. Industry sits on the front lines of ransomware. You are the institutions that are being targeted. You are the institutions whose platforms are being exploited in the laundering of these proceeds. So the government cannot conduct these investigations without you all. You're on the front lines to be able to defend yourselves from this from these devastating attacks that can cripple businesses as well as deprive Americans from access to critical goods and services. But then also, especially on the financial side, given who's all in here, like your platforms are the places that are being exploited to be able to facilitate laundering of these proceeds. So we need to be able to work with industry to try to facilitate that rapid information sharing, to support timely interdiction and prevention of this activity in the first place, but then certainly disruption of the networks after they occurred. So our approach, I know we mentioned the Ivan partnership that we launched, continuing to wanting to reinforce information sharing partnerships on the cybersecurity front to make sure that these criminals never get in the first place, hopefully. But we would encourage more partnerships. We need to continue to grow these things. What can we do to be able to stoke industry? The government and Congress provided the liability protections that I mentioned before under 314B and the Cyber Info Sharing Act. I know FinCEN has been very deliberate in publishing a lot of guidance around 314B to try to highlight what a wide liability protection that this can provide. So I think that what we really need is to continue to figure out how we can stoke industry, to form these partnerships, to drive this, to provide the information back and forth. I'll also highlight that I view compliance as a public-private partnership. The public side issuing the regulations, but then we need you all to comply. The system doesn't work if you just regulate. Policy can just sit there and not be effective if it doesn't actually get actioned on or implemented. So that compliance piece is your part of this public-private partnership of defending the US financial system from money launderers, terrorist financiers, and these ransomware criminals and cyber criminals and everyone else who's trying to leverage cryptocurrency for illicit purposes. So step up to that charge. I know that there's been a lot of really encouraging developments in the space. Alessio spoke to them before about travel rule solutions, looking at things like privacy-preserving technologies that can still allow for discoverability. So there's a lot of encouraging developments here, but we just continue to encourage industry to take note from the executive order and see if there are any measures or directions that they can do to try to support this future vision of the digital asset ecosystem.
So if you had to look down the future corridor, what do you see coming and what do you hope for in this industry?
Great. Well, I definitely know what's coming is we are going to deliver on all the deliverables in the executive order. So there will be a lot of really great reports and frameworks that will continue to drive all the strategic lines of effort of the U.S. government. So I think that will help for a really informed approach to what we want to do for comprehensive, clear regulatory frameworks and controls, but also leveraging the right tools to promote innovation in the space. What I hope for from the space is the ability to build in the technology solutions to these policy problems. I remember sitting in certain forums like at FATF, as well as others, and there would be folks in industry in this emerging tech sector, and I know these are brilliant people telling me how, we can't comply with the travel rule, or it's impossible to comply with sanctions. You can't know who's on the other side of the internet, and some of those conversations didn't seem to really take note of the fact that there had been technologies around for decades that allow for establishing trust and identity on the other side of the internet. So I know that there's a lot of really interesting innovations. I've been so encouraged to see that in the industry space, but I think that we're going to continue to see a lot of people really acknowledge that. The evolution of the entire ecosystem has been so much, even in the past year. And certainly the past 3 to 4 years. So I think that we're going to continue to see folks really figuring out how to build in things like compliance, to build in things like identity and lawful discoverability and revocability, because I think none of us want to be part of a financial system that allows for these illicit actors to be able to easily be able to launder their proceeds. So I think that the responsible actors are going to continue to grow in the space. They're going to try to figure out how to build in compliance up front, like Alessio was talking about.
Well, Carol, thank you very much for spending some time with us this morning.
Thank
Best
you.
luck on the executive order, and we look forward to supporting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.